Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program, The True Costs of Ending Fossil Fuel Use. Please welcome Diana Furchtgott-Roth, Director of the Heritage Foundation Center for Energy, Climate, and Environment.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to talk about the true costs of ending fossil fuel use. We're so honored that you've chosen to take your time today to be here to discuss this very important topic, and we want to welcome our online visitors also. Afterwards, we're going to have questions from the audience, and our online audience will have an opportunity to put their questions in the chat. Well, this is such an important question, and I'm really happy that we can take some time to talk about it with our distinguished visitors. Because a lot of people seem to assume that there's no cost at all to ending fossil fuels, that because the sun shines for free, because the wind blows for free, we can just substitute the existing energy that we have for wind and sun, and the climate will be better off, the planet will be better off, and we'll all have lower electricity bills. It would be so nice if that were true, but unfortunately, that's not quite the reality. And we're honored to have three people here to discuss this, and I'd like to invite them to come up. We have Rupert Darwall from the Real Clear Energy Foundation, who has written a long paper about the experience in the UK of net zero. We have Professor David Legates from the University of Delaware, who's writing a paper about the causes of sea level rise. And we have Kevin Dayaratna, the chief statistician of the Heritage Foundation, who has written a paper on how fossil fuels improve human flourishing and achievement. Basically, we wouldn't be anywhere without fossil fuels, and we want to expand the benefits of fossil fuels to the rest of the world so everyone can have electricity and running water while at the same time making our air cleaner. That's the challenge before us. So with that, each of our speakers is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have questions from all of you, and I'm looking forward to very provocative questions after the presentations. Let's start with Rupert, because he's come from the furthest away from London.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and it is an honor to be speaking on the same panel as my two co-speakers. Sea level rise, absolutely fascinating, part of the biggest myth of climate change, that we're all going to be inundated, the coral atolls of the Pacific going to be wiped away, and Kevin, the genius with numbers, who's exposed the phoniness of the social cost of carbon calculations. Other than perhaps the temporary pandemic lockdowns, net zero is far and away the biggest government experiment ever undertaken in the supposedly free countries of the West. We know how this experiment is going to end. But as Adam Smith said on hearing of Britain's defeat at the hands of George Washington and the American rebels, there is a great deal of ruin in a nation. And the question that faces us all is, how much ruin will we have to endure before the net zero experiment is aborted? America is more fortunate. Thanks to Donald Trump, America is a late starter to this experiment. And when it comes to energy, there are two Americas. There's the free enterprise America of oil and gas production. Last August, US production of crude oil surpassed its pre-pandemic peak. Natural gas production has been even more buoyant and is now running around 8% above its pre-pandemic peak. True, the increases during the Biden years have been paltry compared to the Trump pre-pandemic years, when oil output grew twice as fast and natural gas output grew 3 times faster. But then there's the other America, the electrical grid, in effect run by, or rather ruined by, the EPA, progressive state politicians, and the climate industrial complex. Net zero is the policy of the Biden administration. It has the goal of decarbonizing the grid by 2035. No coal, no natural gas, lots and lots of wind and solar. EV mandates to push gasoline-powered vehicles off the road and force people to rely on a badly compromised and very expensive grid to power their autos. Britain's net zero experiment therefore has much to tell you what lies ahead for America if you guys and if America votes for net zero in November. The first thing to observe is that contrary to claims made by the climate industrial complex, renewable energy is very, very expensive. 15 years ago, the British energy market was dominated by 6 big vertically integrated companies, the Big Six. Because of their market power, the energy regulator required them to file segmental financial and operating data. These enabled detailed comparisons to be made between the costs and performance of different generating technologies. Average revenue, that is to say price per megawatt hour for renewables, is around double that of that the Big Six got from their gas, coal and nuclear power stations. For profitability, the differential is even greater. High prices for renewable electricity resulted in breathtakingly high profits. In 2017, the £54.93 per megawatt hour average profit of the Big Six renewables exceeded the average price that they got for their coal and natural gas generated electricity. And although fuel input costs for coal and natural gas have been more or less flat for that period, over the decade of the 2010s, there was a tripling of environmental levies, and those levies are used to fund renewable subsidies. And they rose from £333 million a year in 2013 to over £1 billion in 2014. So what you've got is a double whammy of renewable subsidies being financed basically off fossil fuel generation. And in addition to that, you've got carbon taxes in the form of cap and trade. So you have this double effect of you have to finance the subsidies and you're paying a carbon price on top of that. So what effectively you have is that lowly, poorly priced fossil fuel output is subsidizing over-remunerated wind and solar power. And renewable, there's an additional cost that doesn't show up directly in the renewable line, and that is that renewable capacity has intermittency, as you all know. The sun doesn't shine the whole time, it goes down at night, and Britain being particularly cloudy in northern latitude, the sun is pretty weak most of the year, and of course the wind doesn't blow the whole time. So the government created a capacity market which basically pays power stations, natural gas principally power stations, to stay idle but to power up when the wind dies down. That electricity is very expensive. To give you an example, in 2020, one of the Big Six coal and gas-fired power stations was selling effectively getting £224 per megawatt hour for the electricity that it supplied via the capacity market. This very expensive electricity properly forms part of the costs of renewable power. But as I'm sure you know, it's never included in the cost estimates, the levelized cost of energy that is produced by particularly people who are favourable to wind and solar. But if thermal generation can't recover its capital costs, especially its embedded capital costs, then there will be no new investment in dispatchable capacity. And that's exactly what has happened. There has been a huge reduction in the amount of dispatchable capacity on the British grid. Since 2010, non-intermittent generating capacity has shrunk by 28.5%, nearly 3/4 of that being accounted for by taking coal-fired power stations off the grid. And they weren't just taken off the grid. You can, if you Google on YouTube, you'll see a clip of the president of COP28, of the Glasgow COP, actually blowing up a coal-fired power station as if that was a jolly good thing. Initially, the government said old coal was going to be replaced by new gas. That never happened because the intermittency of wind and solar destroyed the investment case, the private sector investment case for new gas. So that means that you've ended up with a situation that to keep the lights on, not only are consumers being forced to subsidize wind and solar, they also have to subsidize the dispatchable capacity. As the new energy secretary, as she was then in 2015, Amber Rudd explained, we now have an electricity system in which no form of power generation, not even gas-fired power stations, can be built without government interventions. And that's a big, big problem, because now we come to the fundamental fact of renewables and the energy transition, or rather the energy regression. It consumes more capital to produce less electricity. In 2001, 1 megawatt of generating capacity generated 4,312 megawatt hours of electricity. In 2020, 1 megawatt of generating capacity produced only 3,094 megawatt hours, a decline of 28%. Thus, a 15.5% increase in generating capacity produced 17% less electricity. And by the way, you end up with a less reliable grid. This is the fundamental fact of renewables and the so-called energy transition. I'm just going to make a brief point about Britain's decision to adopt net zero in 2019, which was based on the complete falsehood that renewable energy, and particularly offshore wind, was very cheap. And they would, at the time, the government was quoting £50 per megawatt hour, when in reality, analysis of accounting data of offshore wind shows break-even costs north of £100 per megawatt hour. What can be done about the propagation of this falsehood? So my big policy recommendation for you to go away with is open the books, require all renewable generation capacity that benefits from any form of government intervention is required to file annual reports of operational and financial data, so people and politicians and commentators can see what the real cost of renewable energy is. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have slides, I believe. There we go. One of the things is I'm from Delaware, and one of the concerns is that we constantly hear that sea level rise is going to destroy the state. I mean, this has been one of the issues from the beginning. Delaware is a low-lying state. We are the lowest elevation state, and so what's likely to happen at some point is that we are going underwater. And so we're going to do everything we can to stop that. And of course, that means ceasing fossil fuels. So on August 3rd of 2023, we decided Delaware will be net zero by 2050. We're going to have half of our carbon cut by 2030. And we've already enacted that because if we can do that, we can stop the seas from rising. They'll show us maps like this. And one of the things you see is it's 15 meters of sea level rise, which is about 50 feet. According to current calculations, that would take about 50 centuries to get there. Nevertheless, that scares people into action, and that's one of the reasons why we've gotten that enacted. The fact of the matter is sea level has been rising for the last 20,000 years and probably will continue to rise until one of two things happens. Either we go into the next ice age or until we run out of ice. And in particular, we see that one of the issues that raises up is that it's not like a bathtub. People think it's like filling a bathtub, that it goes up the same everywhere. It clearly does not. If we look at change in sea surface height, let's say over the past 28 years, you can see that there's a lot more variability in mid-latitude. Some places have gone up by about 15 centimeters, and some places have actually gone down in terms of sea level. So it's certainly not like filling a bathtub. Now, in the paper that is going to be coming out probably next week through Heritage, there's a number of things I talk about regarding sea level rise, and for the rest of the talk, I'm going to briefly run through those. The change in water levels is one of the first things that we think of, and the first thing that's mentioned is the thermal expansion of seawater. Water is an incompressible fluid, so when you warm water, it rises. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us that it's about 1.1 millimeter a year. due to simply rising temperatures, which may be largely naturally drawn, maybe to a small degree affected with carbon dioxide. The second thing is the melting of the ice caps and glaciers. Warmer temperatures causes ice and snow to melt. That water's got to go somewhere. It winds up in the oceans as well. And in particular, if we look at that rate that the IPCC tells us, it's about 2.5 millimeters a year, which winds up being about 1 inch per decade, or about 10 inches a century. But there's a lot more going on than just those two processes that they generally focus on. One is precipitation. One of the things is that when it rains on the Earth's surface, that water goes to evaporation, but it also goes to runoff, and it changes the amount of water in the ocean. And a lot of people don't realize that when you look at the oceans, one of the things you actually see is a seasonal cycle associated with sea level rise. So in particular, like right now, we've got a lot of seasonal snow cover. We've got water in the soil at field capacity. So there's a lot of water being stored on land. By the time we get to September, October, all that snow will have melted. We will have had the plants using that water, and that water goes back to the ocean. And that gives us a seasonal variability of about 2 inches, due simply to changes in precipitation and water storage on the land. But it's also sea level forcing. One of the things people don't realize is that atmospheric and oceanic circulation affects how the oceans work and how the oceans circulate. And I won't go into lots of them, but I will focus on El Nino and La Nina, because you've probably heard lots about those. During a La Nina event, we have very strong trade winds that blow in the east in the tropics. And what you see is the water piles up in the Western Pacific. When an El Nino event comes along, such as like we have now, we get weakened trade winds over most of the Pacific. And in fact, over some parts, we get westerly winds that blow the opposite direction. That causes the water to flow back in the opposite way. And it causes major changes in sea level in the Central Pacific. And you can see this is about 1.5 to 1 2/3 of an inch of change, a decrease in the Western Pacific and an increase in the Eastern Pacific, simply because of the onset of an El Nino event. We also look at the effects of planetary rotation and gravitational acceleration. This is because of effects associated with angular momentum and so forth. I won't spend much time on it because it gets quite complex. But for example, wobbles of the Earth on its axis, such as a Chandler wobble, matches up very well with fluctuations in sea level. And finally, the one that people forget, particularly in Delaware, is changes in land surface elevation. It looks like the water is going up if what you're standing on goes down. And so the question is, how much does the land surface change? And one of the features associated with that is isostatic or glacial subsidence and rebound. When you take, for example, a large continent, such as North America, and we put a large ice block on the top of it, it creates weight. It causes the land to subside, and what happens is the land around it, therefore, starts to rise. So you get a pushing or a subsidence under the ice sheet, but you get a rise on the outer edges. Well, when the deglaciation happens, the ice sheet melts, the ice sheet disappears, the land that was pushed down rises, but isostatically the land around that edge descends. That's exactly what's happening in the mid-Atlantic region. Here we can see in Delaware, for example, and in New Jersey, that we have a isostatic rebound. In this case at Reedy Point, it's 8.2 inches since 1900. And when we compare that descending, I should say, of the land compared with some of the assessments of what the sea level rise is offshore, you can see that 2/3 of the sea level rise associated in Delaware is really due to the fact that land is descending and not the water rising. So if we really spend all of our time and effort and money to try to stop climate change, to try to save us from sea level rise, what we're finding out is we're not going to have an impact, and in a sense, we're going to gut our economy.
Okay. All right. So Kevin, do you want to talk about your two papers, including the most latest one about how fossil fuels benefit human flourishing?
My name is Kevin Dayaratna. I'm the Chief Statistician, Data Scientist, and Senior Research Fellow here at the Heritage Foundation. I'm going to talk about powering human advancement, the necessity of affordable and reliable energy. Firstly, energy in and of itself is a fundamental building block of civilization. From lighting up your homes, to enabling you to drive your cars, to enabling protesters to get to certain locations, energy is literally the basis of anything and everything we do. And sadly, many people, including the people who walked out of this room, take it for granted. So, over the last couple of centuries, there has been a very interesting and fascinating energy revolution. And it's especially fascinating if you're interested in physics. The steam engine has fundamentally transformed the concept of bulk transportation. Electricity has fundamentally transformed the economy, as I was alluding to earlier. Lighting up your homes, turning on your cars, going to work, using a laptop. People take electricity for granted until they actually incur a power outage. The internal combustion engine. This is the key to the car, as well as the airplane, as well as modern travel. So how has energy consumption evolved over time? I'm going to present some data from a recent paper co-authored with my colleagues Miles Pollard, Richard Stern, and Diana Furchtgott-Roth. How has American energy consumption evolved over time? So here we have two plots of total consumption as well as per capita consumption in America. In terms of total consumption, you could see in 1900, the United States consumed about slightly over 9 quadrillion British thermal units of energy, and this has steadily risen to slightly around 100 or so quadrillion BTUs of energy, around 96 or so. And you could see on a per capita basis, there has also been quite an evolution, from around 128 million BTUs to slightly over 300. And you could see the same phenomenon globally. So how have people all across the world benefited from this energy revolution? Well, let's think about household technologies, many things we take for granted. This is from our paper. Running water, we could see a tremendous increase, and many people take this for granted, but the fact is the x-axis in all these subplots is time in terms of year. The y-axis is the percent of households that actually use these things. Running water, we see over time it has gradually permeated American households, but only after the 1950s or so was it really commonplace. Same thing for the refrigerator, the flushing toilet, radios, automobiles, and so forth. One thing has declined, the landline. Why? Because we all now have cell phones. So alongside these increases in energy consumption, what have we also seen? How has per capita income changed alongside these increases? Well, if we look at per capita GDP, both globally and domestically, we could see tremendous increases, about 500% increases. In terms of, from a global perspective, global per capita income has risen from around $2,000 in the early 1900s to around $15,000 in recent years. And the United States has also seen similar increases, percentage-wise. Right now, per capita income is around $55,000, and it was, I think, around $20,000 or so at the start of the century. Life expectancy. This has also skyrocketed over the years. Life expectancy globally, many people don't seem to realize this, was only 30 years of age in 1900 and is now slightly above 70 years of age. In the United States, it was slightly under 50 years of age in the early 1900s, and now it is in the high 70s. The great question is, what will it take to get higher? But as you can see, so why have these two things, life expectancy and GDP, risen over time? Well, in terms of income, when you think about it, as a result of having access to affordable and reliable energy, firms can produce more goods and services with the same amount of capital input in terms of input of capital and labor. In terms of life expectancy, doctors now have more tools at their disposal as a result of the medical innovations that have hinged on the ability to access affordable and reliable energy. And we're going to get to that more in a little bit. How about child mortality? Again, for the same reason, child mortality, fortunately, has plummeted all across the globe over the last century. Corn and wheat yields all across the world. They have also risen steadily over time, and there's a simple reason for that, as well as other agricultural yields. Farming isn't what it used to be. Now farmers utilize concepts of GPS, remote sensing, water irrigation. Concepts that are interesting to statisticians like me, such as machine learning, are now permeating the agricultural industry. This data, however, captures changes across time. A great question is, What about recent variation across the globe? Here you go. What is the link between per capita energy consumption and per capita GDP? This is a snapshot. Each dot is a country. The x-axis is per capita energy consumption, and the y-axis is per capita GDP. And you could see a steady increase. As countries have more access to affordable and reliable energy, you have greater per capita GDP. How about poverty? So here again, the x-axis is the per capita energy consumption in kilowatt hours. The y-axis is the percentage of the people within a country living on less than $30 a day. And you could see a drastic plummeting once per capita energy consumption increases. How about agricultural yield? Like I said, all across the world, agricultural yield has increased. However, in this day and age, still some countries do better than others. And again, access to affordable and reliable energy enables better farming. How about public health? This is one of the more interesting ones. Number of doctors per 1,000 people is so we got 4 charts here. The uppermost corner is the number of doctors per 1,000 people. The upper right corner is the life expectancy in years. And the bottom 2 are child mortality and maternal mortality. And you can see the number of doctors available per 1,000 people on a per capita basis increases. Countries such as Japan are toward the top of the list. And the reason why? Affordable and reliable energy enables the training of doctors. People have to go through medical school and residency to become doctors, and they need tools at their disposal to be able to work in a particular country. Life expectancy. Again, doctors have more tools at their disposal if there is affordable and reliable energy to develop these tools and to utilize these tools. Child mortality and maternal mortality similarly plummet all across the globe as a result of access to affordable and reliable energy. This, to me, is one of the most interesting ones. Regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, everybody wants clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment. So you look at this, the first chart is deaths due to air pollution. And again, the x-axis is per capita consumption in kilowatt hours. The second chart is deaths due to dirty water. And the x-axis is per capita consumption in terms of kilowatt hours. And again, you could see the dramatic relations, the dramatic drops as a result of access to affordable and reliable energy. The reason is very, very simple. As a result of having access to affordable and reliable energy, countries can go away from burning biomass to actually developing clean energy that is not soot, that does not harm their lungs. Again, with water, many people take drinking a glass of water for granted. But as a result of having access to affordable and reliable energy, there are better ways to clean the water, to purify the water, to transport the water, and distribute the water. Speaking of which, public health impacts, what are the most common deaths associated with environmental issues? This comes from a paper from Bjorn Lundberg that was published during the pandemic in 2020, the most commonly caused environmental deaths in 2017. Outdoor air pollution, indoor air pollution, and unsafe water top the list. There are some other causes: lead, sanitation, hand washing, ozone. Global warming is actually toward the bottom of the list. But if you look at the top 3, you got air pollution and you have unsafe water. You want to reduce these? Well, if you go back to my prior chart, enabling access to affordable and reliable energy is certainly a way to do it. So, what does this tell us? Advice for policymakers. It is imperative that lawmakers understand the inextricable link between energy and human flourishing. It is fundamentally important to enable people to access energy, not constrict it. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'd like to start by asking the first question, then we're going to take a question from our audience. To any of you on the panel, there's 3 to 6 billion people in the world without electricity and without running water. Is it possible for these individuals to get to standards of living of Western Europe and the United States without the use of fossil fuels?
I don't see how that's possible.
At least, right, yeah. I mean, my personal opinion is I don't see how it's possible. There are, I mean, and again, I'm not a promoter of fossil fuels. I think all forms of energy should be able to compete on a level playing field. But right now, fossil fuels are definitely a way to improve access. So you saw those scatter plots I had in my presentation. And the countries that did quite poorly were many of these countries that didn't have access to affordable and reliable energy, such as in Africa. And if you want to make these countries wealthier, if you want to make these people better off, let's give them access to these types of energies. Nuclear power is also conceivably an option, but again, the question is, the fundamental question is access to affordable and reliable energy, and if you're going to start to take that off the map, then there are going to be consequences.
Yeah, I'd just add to that, Diana, that far and away the lowest cost, most reliable form of energy for electricity generation is coal. And for the global south, there isn't really an alternative to coal-fired electricity. And if you look at countries like Bangladesh or Pakistan and much of sub-Saharan Africa, they are consuming pounds, or rather ounces, of coal per capita per year. These people are energy starved, and for them to have a better life, that's got to change from pounds to ounces to tons per year. That is, you can't escape that. So yes, when people say ban coal, don't finance coal-fired power stations, what they're really doing is keeping some of the poorest people in the world poor.
Okay. Questions from the audience. If you could identify yourself before you ask your question, that would be great. Let's start with you and wait for the mic.
Hi, I'm Robert DiDomenico with Cargo Fish. I develop a utility distribution system for fast-moving consumer goods that can save a lot of energy. But my question was, how do we deal with sanctimonious hypocrites, ultra-crepidarian morons that behave like Nazis all over the place? How do you get past that? The same people screaming that everybody should use less usually jump in a private jet to go get their award. They're liars. They're poisoning the kids. How do we deal with the spread of stupidity?
Well, let's first give the panel a chance to answer, and then we have maybe an answer in the back over here.
So my thoughts on this, I've thought about this many times. I love having conversations with people who disagree with me, but then there comes a point when you deal with people like this.
Yeah.
The idea is, the best approach to this is you present scholarly work, you present ideas that have meat and substance on them, and the people who can actually engage with you will. The people who are incapable, like the people we saw earlier, will look like they do. And I think that really speaks volumes to handling this, because they will just be the people who look to be the odd ones out.
I wanted to punch their lights out.
Well, no, we are fortunate that we have a good security team to deal with people like this, and that there was minimal interruption. Mario, did you have an answer to that question? How about waiting for the mic and identifying yourself for our online audience?
Mario Loyola. Oh, there's an online audience. Fantastic. Mario Loyola, Heritage Foundation. So I just wanted to say, in answer to your question, that I pointed out to the young man who first got up to disrupt outside, that these people are performing exactly the same function as OPEC, which is to increase windfall profits for oil companies, because that's all that a constriction in the oil supply does. It has no other effect except to pad energy company profits. After their heads have exploded, they might think about it a little.
Let's take a question from our online audience. And for those of you online, you can put a question in the chat, and then it'll be conveyed to me on this little machine that was made with the fruits of fossil fuels, I should say. Would data, this is I think to you, Kevin, because it came at the same time as you were presenting, would data similar to this be used by the Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office to evaluate effectiveness of rules and legislation? If not, why not? What can be done to keep the government from stopping this short-sighted stuff and shoving it down our throats? Question mark.
Okay. I think, so that's a very, very good question. So I think the way that, having worked in this field for like now the last 11 years, I've noticed the best way to address questions with meat is not just modeling, but it's laying models on top of models. So this is actually, I think, a good description of the state of nature, about how countries need access to affordable and reliable energy. Now, in terms of the regulations itself, we actually have another model here at the Heritage Foundation, which I didn't have time to get into. This is also a government model, the model for the assessment of greenhouse gas-induced climate change, MAGIC with 2 C's. And with this model, you can tweak assumptions regarding CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions going forward and quantify the impact on temperatures. And what we've noticed with this model is that if the United States, suppose right now the United States were to magically halt fossil fuels immediately, and there would be some sort of dominance of renewables. The impact on global temperatures by the end of the century would be less than 0.2 degrees Celsius, even assuming an overly sensitive climate. The impact of the EU doing the same thing would be less than 0.13 degrees Celsius. So, and there are plenty of other questions that you could look at. For example, I've quantified the impact of getting rid of internal combustion engine vehicles and replacing them all with EVs. And I can't remember how many zeros were to the right of the decimal when I calculated the temperature impact by the end of the century. Yep. So the answer to the question is we should not just look at, use data like this. This data can always be used as a nice supplement, but what we should do is layer model on top of model. And this is a government model, and I encourage the public to use this model as well in submitting regulatory comments.
Question from the audience. Yes. If you could identify yourself and wait for the microphone.
Oh, hello, y'all. James Jackson. So in America, with our aging infrastructure, especially when looking at the power grid, would there ever be a realistic scenario where a lot of these energy initiatives, for example, in California, they're trying to get rid of all the sale of all gas-powered cars by 2035. However, the grid is already overloaded currently. Is there any way to reach people and tell them how unrealistic these ideals are?
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening in Delaware. And I made a presentation to a Republican group, and they were stunned because they didn't know this was even happening. And once they got galvanized and people started to hear about it, there has been a backlash in Delaware. And we're a small state, so things go faster in Delaware. But there has been a backlash against this. I don't know that the people in office are going to pay any attention to it, but there's a lot of groundswell coming that this is not what we want. This is a fundamental problem, and they start to see all this stuff. And I think these people make virtually no inroads with the general public because they don't relate to them. But if we start to tell them what's happening, why it's happening, things like this, what is going on in the real world, they see the facts. They can make those decisions for themselves. Just screaming at them with stuff never works, but coming back with facts and rational arguments is what will win the day.
Exactly.
Online question for Rupert Darwall. I understand that there's an election coming up in the UK. Is there going to be any change from the election, and what can be done to change the course of climate change policies in Britain?
Yes, indeed, there will be an election. By law, it should be held by January next year. It's most likely going to be held in the autumn of this year. What change will there be? There is an overwhelmingly strong probability that Labour will win the election. If anything, they are more committed to net zero than the Conservatives. The only sort of upside, if you like, from a net zero point of view of getting rid of this, because Britain wrote, Parliament wrote net zero into law in 2019. The only possibility of a political party changing its view on that is if the Conservatives suffer such a big electoral defeat that they wake up and say, we've actually got to do something differently. And we have got to confront the problem that is net zero. Net zero is draining growth out of the economy. It's pushing up electricity bills. And to Kevin's point about fossil fuel usage and poverty reduction, what we've seen in Britain is the reverse going on. And a particular egregious example of that was in the first Cameron government, the coalition government, the energy secretary changed the definition of energy poverty, right, to make it less sensitive to increases in energy prices. So they just changed the measure so that their policies would look not as bad in terms of increasing energy policies, which their policies are doing. And so they change it from being a measure of the number of households which were energy poverty in terms of the proportion of household spending on energy, around about 10%, to a measure of buildings that were inadequately insulated. So what is clear demonstration that actually policymakers know that their policies are making people poorer, and in particular, hitting the poorest hardest.
Audience question? I believe you asked one before, so let's go to this gentleman over here. If you could identify yourself and wait for the mic.
Hi, my name is Sean Hagan. I'm with Hagan Global Consulting and Global Energy Education. And Rupert, I think you had a point where not all capacity is equal in terms of generating energy. I mean, if you look at solar or wind energy, per megawatt, it'll generate on the order of magnitude 2,000 megawatt hours per year per megawatt, give or take. Nuclear, on the other hand, will generate over, close to 6,000 megawatt hours per year per megawatt. Would it make any sense, in your opinion, and this is to the panel, to require solar and wind to become dispatchable? In other words, to try to equalize the differences in energy. Right now, just to clarify, the differences in those capacities is, on one hand, on the dispatchable units, it's tied to their engineering performance, what the grid needs and the performance of the different technologies. Whereas on the renewables, it's tied to when the sun shines and so on. So if you made everything dispatchable, then it's just going to be tied to the performance characteristics. And when the grid, the machine, the integrated machine, needs their different power.
Great question.
That's a very interesting proposal. And indeed, in 2017, the British government commissioned one of Britain's leading energy economists, Sir Dieter Helm, to do a cost of energy review. And one of the things he pointed out was that intermittent generators impose costs on the rest of the grid because of their intermittency, that these costs were unknown, they were hypothetical because there weren't ways of allocating the costs to where they are arising. And his answer is very similar to your proposal, which is to require all generators to make firm power equivalent bids into the wholesale market, which would thereby require intermittent generators to hedge their power output by basically procuring capacity from gas-fired generators. So absolutely, that is the right way to go. That is to create a genuine level playing field where the true economics of wind and solar will be exposed.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I've always been a long advocate of letting all forms of energy compete on a level playing field. And I think the problem with the subsidies that this administration and prior administrations have pursued is that no politician has the foresight to understand what's going to be the best approach to these things, and it will put capital in the wrong places.
Well, if I may, and I'll
quick follow-up.
Quick follow-up.
Very quick. Yeah.
Very quick. A very quick follow-up. I would say that all technologies cannot compete. It's because that's like asking first gear to compete with third gear or second gear. The different types of energy or technologies perform different functions in the grid.
That is true to some extent, yeah.
So you want first gear competing with other first gear.
I mean, they should be able to complement each other.
That's in the weeds, but yeah. I just want to throw that out there. Thank you.
Well, wind and solar are always going to have to be backed up unless you're willing to have brownouts and blackouts. Yes. And that's the problem, is if you put them treat them as dispatchable, they're not. So when they go out, you don't have any backup, and we'll have blackouts and brownouts. If you back them up, then we're essentially wasting energy because you're counting energy twice, and that's wasting.
Online question for David Legates. Have you seen Al Gore's movie An Inconvenient Truth, and how did he get the data, and why hasn't his sea level rise come to pass?
His sea level rise is, well, start backwards. His sea level rise has not come to pass because his assumption was that it's based largely on temperature. And in a sense, if you look at the record, for example, if you go back to the Battery in New York City, okay, the record in the Battery goes back to before the Civil War. It essentially says sea level rise has been linear from that before the Civil War to now. There is no ramp up with CO2. It's just been a linear increase. And why is that? It's because we're coming out of the last ice age. We're slowly getting warmer, so the ocean is becoming more expansing through thermal expansion. We're getting more melt of the ice caps and glaciers. And so it's a linear process. They always tell us that the model is immediately going to start this upshoot that you're going to see over time, but it never does. And I don't think it ever will, because I don't think it's very much tied to climate change as it is tied to the end of the last ice age. And the rise will stop when either we go into another ice age or we run out of ice caps and glaciers. Yes, I have seen Inconvenient Truth. It's been a while because there's been a number of other ridiculous things that have come out since then. I can't remember the other question you had.
No, that was it. Yeah.
That was enough, okay.
Yeah. Question from the audience here. Otherwise, we have a lot more online. Yes.
So I just wanted to ask a comment on the crazy.
Wait for mine.
Rob DiDomenico again. The crazy hypocrisy of subsidizing battery electric vehicles in Hawaii, where anyone can look up the United States Energy Information Agency data on the generation sources of energy for Hawaiian electricity, which is 2/3 oil and equal parts coal and renewables. So Hawaiian electric cars don't do anything to stop or even slow the burning of fossil fuels. In fact, they accelerate it. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Great question. Any comment on Hawaiian electric cars?
That's exactly why, for reasons like that my estimates, since I haven't published the results yet, I don't remember how many zeros are to the right of the decimal. That's actually an overestimate of the climate change that would actually be achieved as a result of getting rid of all internal combustion engine vehicles. Because people don't seem to realize that when you were going to charge a car, there is energy associated with that. And at this point, you're not going to be doing it without using fossil fuels.
Online question. Have you analyzed the latest carbon tax proposals in Congress, and what would the likely effects of passing a carbon tax be?
I have not analyzed the latest version, but I've analyzed many prior versions of it before. And the definition of insanity is doing something over and over and over again and expecting a different result. You don't expect a different result because it's always the same thing. It kills the economy. And this is not using our own models. This is using the Department of Energy's National Energy Modeling System, another government model. And as a result of this, because what happens is you raise the fundamental building block of civilization, as I talked about, energy, by imposing a tax on it. What happens is there are consequences all across the board in terms of employment, in terms of GDP loss, and in terms of electricity expenditures for households. And you can see consequences all across the board. My last estimates were, and this was an underestimate, because actually the Biden administration's goals crashed this government model. So this estimate was around $8 trillion of GDP loss through 2040, or through about a 20-year time horizon. And again, that's an underestimate. We've looked at the Green New Deal via carbon tax, which was not a carbon tax, but the carbon tax is one of the easier ways of simulating this, as well as many other policies. And again, the story is always the same.
Mario, if you could identify yourself for the online audience.
I don't think it's on. That's it. Yeah.
Hello. So actually a follow-up on that very question. So what most people understand by a carbon tax is a Pigouvian effort to force polluters to internalize the externality of carbon pollution, right? Yeah. That's the idea that people think of when they think of a carbon tax. And I don't know if you want to explain in answering this, Mr. Pigou and his tax, but anyway. But the Pigouvian tax depends upon a reliable estimate of what the numerical value of that externality is. And in this case, we're talking about the social cost of carbon. With even the IPCC, with IPCC's equilibrium climate sensitivity estimates, or the IPCC collation of estimates, being sort of all over the place between 1 degree Celsius and 5 degrees Celsius, the social cost of carbon at the end of the day, as we understand it now, is speculative. I mean, the numerical value is speculative. Maybe there is
it could even be negative. Yeah,
it could be negative. We don't know what it is. And without a reliable numerical estimate, the concept of a Pigouvian tax breaks down. And so what you end up with is a tax that actually has a different policy purpose, which is just whatever level you have to set the tax to have an impact on carbon emissions. But that's not a Pigouvian tax. And so that's does the public on all of the carbon tax proposals in Congress, are they even an attempt to rigorously force polluters to internalize the cost of carbon pollution? Or are they just coming up with a way to limit carbon pollution?
Or doesn't that undermine? Or are they just coming up with another way to tax us, which Congress is always looking for?
Yeah. Rupert, did you want to take that?
Yeah, I think the thing is that Pigouvian taxes, which I sort of don't really like, because if Kevin comes up with a social cost of carbon that's negative, it implies you'd subsidize fossil fuel consumption, which doesn't sound the right thing to do.
Well, perhaps in some parts of the world it is, though.
For poor people, just as a poverty thing, but
very poor countries, for example, you could see that it would be worth doing.
It might be, but yes.
Take Burkina Faso, for example.
But what we've had is, so instead of saying that we should have a carbon tax set at the social cost of carbon, so that the externalities are internalized, what actually we happen, and policies all geared around meeting CO2 reduction targets, and therefore the level of carbon tax is calculated to achieve a quantitative target, which does not reflect the social cost of carbon. And if you go to the IPCC special report, the 1.5 degree special report that launched us on this mad road to net zero, from memory, it talks about having a carbon tax in sort of 2040 or 2050 of about $1,000 per ton. I mean, so if you're targeting net zero, you have very, very high, I mean, eye-wateringly high levels of carbon taxes, which the only virtue of it is it just exposes that people are not going to go down this path. It is just going to tax the economy it will destroy the economy and destroy people's living standards.
Yeah, I'd like to piggyback off of what Rupert said to answer Mario's question. Also, Mario raised a very, very good point, that the concept of the social cost of carbon is intended to quantify the economic impact associated with CO2 emissions. So the idea is, from a Pigouvian perspective, you would implement a carbon tax that would nullify the social cost of carbon. Now, the thing is this. I think that Mario is absolutely right that what the government is doing is they have the carbon tax in mind, and what they're doing is they're using the social cost of carbon to rubber stamp this agenda. And we've brought these models in-house at Heritage. That's another class of models we have at Heritage. And we've tweaked these assumptions in very reasonable ways, and as Rupert noted, under very reasonable assumptions, the SEC can be 0 or even negative. And again, what they have done is you have a bunch of government bureaucrats getting together in a room, and they are cooking the books to beef up the social cost of carbon as high as they want. And now the Biden administration has beefed it up even higher than the Obama administration has done. It's absolutely ridiculous. They're fascinating statistical models, especially for a stats geek like me. But the bottom line is they can be manipulated to get pretty much any result you want, which is precisely what you see the government doing.
That's exactly what the climate models are doing. I mean, when you look at a climate model, for example, there's 2 major assumptions that are built into the model that makes them always, what we say, run hot. The first is that they assume more carbon dioxide is going to go into the atmosphere than anybody believes. We almost always revert to something called SSP 5-8.5. That's 8.5 watts per square meter of forcing. In order to get that, you would pretty much have to convert everything over to dirty coal. Okay, so they overstate the amount of carbon dioxide that will go into the atmosphere by 2100. The second thing is we know that the model specified sensitivity is a tunable parameter. So those numbers that they use are much higher than what we assume that we measure by looking at observations. So you make the model more sensitive to carbon dioxide, and then you hit it with a hammer that says there'll be more carbon dioxide than we believe it's going to be. You get a big climate signal, and that's why when you start to track what actually happens, it's always running hot because it's guaranteed to run hot. And then that feeds back into these economic models that says the social cost of carbon is even higher, and away we go.
There's actually a paper on this. I think David may recall more details of it. It's been a couple of years since I read it. It's titled by Jordan, The Art and Science of Model Tuning. There's actually instructions about how to do this for climate scientists.
That's one of the things we were trying to fight. I was briefly in the Trump administration, and I was director of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which is responsible for the U.S. National Climate Assessment. So I know how the sausage is made. And I know in particular there was a fight to try to make it more balanced, to try to get it so that we were using more reasonable scenarios, more reasonable climate models. And of course, once the administration took over with the new administration, all that was lost.
Professor Roy Spencer of the University of Alabama, Huntsville just published a paper here at the Heritage Foundation on global warming, climate models, and observations. And with this, what you could see is the disparity between how these models have run and how observations have done. And there's no denial that the climate has been changing, temperatures have warmed. But the real question is to what degree, no pun intended. And since when? And then so you have temperatures running this hot, according to the models, and in reality, you have something like this.
Two more questions, one from our online audience and one from one of you. Here's from the online audience. Billions per year are being spent on emissions mitigation in the transportation and energy production industries to the effect that 60 trucks today equals the emissions of one truck from 25 years ago. Yet these industries are not being financially rewarded for the billions they invest. Why not?
Yeah, it's not politically expedient.
Not politically expedient.
Yeah.
All right.
You don't get anything from that, say.
Okay, here's another one. I did not see a quantification of the true life cycle cost of ending fossil fuels in any of the presentations. Stephen Koonin, in his recent book, Unsettled, estimated the cost of CCS alone at $1 trillion per year.
I briefly mentioned this in the Q&A with the Heritage Energy model. Through a carbon tax, you can see about $8 trillion loss in GDP under a $300 carbon tax that is intended to somewhat get at the Biden administration's agenda. But yeah, no, it's a great question.
I mean, so what going to net zero means is there's two effects, two financial effects. First of all, you are destroying embedded capital of hydrocarbon energy. You're basically writing all that embedded investment off. That makes us poorer. And then you're replacing it with much more expensive, less efficient, less reliable capital. So it's effectively, you've got a double hit. And that hit comes out of ultimately, it comes out of one thing. There's no magic money tree. It comes out of resources available for people to live their lives. It comes out of consumption.
Last question from the audience. Any one more question? Anyone who has not asked a question would like to ask one? Okay, we'll take one from over here.
Hi, this is Sean Hagan again. So I was reading an article lately that tied some of the climate perturbations to solar cycles. So this is way away from my field of expertise, but wanted to get the panel's thoughts on, is there a chance that some of the that there could be a corresponding changes in the weather that we've been seeing or changing climate to other causes than have been studied so far, such as solar cycles or anything else?
My colleague Willie Soon, who's now with Ceres Science, which is his own company, and Michael and Ronan Connolly have been working on this, and you can see a lot of variations associated with the sun. I mean, it makes total sense that the sun would be a major driver of climate. After all, 99.9999% of all the energy in the Earth's climate system originated from the sun. So if the sun became warmer, we wind up in warm periods. When the sun becomes colder or less output, we get a little ice age, for example. So there's very correlations like that. If we talk to Roy Spencer, he says it's a lot of natural variability. The idea is a lot of these equations are not linear, they're nonlinear. You get weird things with nonlinearities, so you get warm-ups that take place, you get cool-downs, you get a lot of fluctuations that occur naturally. So the sun plays a role, natural variability plays a role. To some extent, carbon dioxide does play a role, but I think it's a minor role simply because the radiation budget is not the only game in town, and particularly one of the ways, for example, cars warm up is not because that sunlight gets in the windows and can't get out. It's because you've cut off two of the major mechanisms by which we exchange heat at the surface: moving air and evaporating water. And so when you make it just to one of those features, then you get an overestimate of temperature. So it's not, climate is not this simple thing, energy goes in, temperature must go up. It gets redistributed, lots of other things are happening. There's external forcing, there's internal forcing. That's why I found it so fun to study until things like this happen.
Final words from our three panelists, just to sum up. Let's go Rupert, Kevin, and David. Rupert, any final thoughts for the audience?
Yeah, my final thought is what we saw earlier, that the absolute key thing in this is to keep debating, to keep our voices heard, and not be shouted down by a bunch of juvenile imbeciles.
Or anyone else, yes. Or also a bunch of elite intellectuals.
Yeah.
No, thank you, Rupert. And thank you, Diana, for putting this wonderful panel together. And thank you, David, for joining us. What I just wanted to reiterate was, and I intend to sound like a broken record, again, human flourishing is fundamentally linked to access to affordable and reliable energy. And I think lawmakers need to realize they need to be very, very careful if they're going to engage in policies that can impact this and change the portfolio from which we can choose. This is especially important, not just here, but all across the globe. And if you want to lift people out of poverty, I've given you the answer.
It's not just poverty. I mean, think about what did we use for inexpensive energy prior to the Industrial Revolution? You used a lot of animals and you used other humans, slavery. So why do we not need cheap labor anymore from individuals or from animals? Because we can get it from fossil fuels. We can build machines that will do our work. And that allows for freedom, not just for us, but for everyone. These people don't understand this. But free, cheap energy, inexpensive energy through fossil fuels has helped garner the freedom of virtually everyone on the planet.
Yeah, including freedom of people to come and film us with their cell phones, which wouldn't be possible without fossil fuels. Well, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank all of you for listening, both the in-person and the online audience. And we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you. Let's give our